So as a general overview, so we'll talk briefly about fueling for rowing. So what are the sort of the normal daily and weekly energy requirements across people who train little, people who train a lot, people who are little, people who are bigger. So I'm going to come up with, I'm a numbers man, so I'll put forward the numbers that are needed to fuel the machine, and Emily's going to come back with some practical examples of what those numbers look like. And then go through some specific examples around training, competition, recovery. Then we're going to touch on a really important topic, which is what happens when you're not getting enough fuel, and the signs and symptoms and how we manage it, how we notice it, because that's something, especially in the elite athletes, we deal with quite a lot. Then specifically around strategies for weight loss and weight gain, which might be applicable to heavyweights wanting to gain weight or transitioning to seniors, and lightweights who are trying to hit that target weight. And then we'll touch briefly on the end around supplements as well.
Sound okay?
Yeah. So firstly, I just want to talk about metabolic rates. So talking about the fuel, the energy the body needs to function. So we first need to know what the body needs before we even add exercise. So metabolic rate, or BMR, RMR, we might be referred to as, is just the basic energy your body needs to function. So to circulate the blood, to keep the brain going, all that sort of stuff. And then we also need energy to digest and absorb food, and also to support the activities of daily life, and then training on top. So our total daily energy expenditure is made up of that metabolic rate of just us being, the energy required to metabolize the food we're having, and then the physical activity, which is what we do just day to day, and then plus the structured exercise sessions. So in terms of metabolic rate, what can affect it? Obviously, you might have heard before that muscle burns more than fat, which is true. So people who are more muscular will burn more energy just at rest. Young burn more energy than old, unfortunately. Big people, little people, just to regulate temperature and bigger organs, all that sort of stuff. Males over females, mainly due to body size. Genetics, there are those lucky people out there who just burn more energy at rest and have high metabolisms. Physical activity, the people who are more active are going to burn more energy just from being, and obviously other things like environmental factors, and sometimes manipulating the diet to have lots of small meals versus lots of fewer big meals can speed up the way the body just is at rest. Okay, so now for a little bit of numbers. So this is daily energy needs before we consider exercise. So when we're just talking about the metabolism and just your lifestyle. So to sort of give you a bit of perspective, I've tried to break it down into 4 or 5 groups, being school-age rowers around 16 years old and a bit lighter, club rowers who I've just sort of penciled in at about 25 years old. Then we've got our junior elite, our more senior elite, and then our masters rowers as well. So this is an indication of what you would, if you weren't training, what you just need to survive. So there's some interesting things here just to look at the influence of age and body weight, and specifically looking at a lightweight or a heavyweight male needing about 60% more just to function at rest when considering age and size as well. Okay? And for those who are not familiar with, I'm going to be talking about kilojoules in here, but if those are more familiar with calories, it's about four times more, so 1 calorie, 4 kilojoules. Okay, so when we consider exercise, there's lots of things that obviously affect how much energy we burn in exercise as well. So the main ones being modality. So is it a weight-bearing exercise? Is it like running? Or is it a supported exercise like cycling? So the energy required to run is much greater than cycling because you have to support your own body weight. Is it a full body exercise or is it partial? So rowing is cross-country skiing are 2 of the biggest ones because you're using your whole body. Whereas, again, cycling or something where you're just using a part of your body is not going to obviously burn as much energy. And then there's also considerations of being upright or horizontal. So swimming's one where you're supported, but you're also horizontal. So it's not as much energy required to get the blood around the body. Intensity, obviously, the harder you train, the more energy you're going to burn, but also at higher intensities, you might be more prone to use carbohydrates. At lower intensities, using more fat. So that's some considerations about the type of energy we're burning during exercise. And then clearly duration, the longer you go for. So those are some of the things when we're thinking about fueling around exercise, we have to consider, because different activities are going to require different fuels.
And how efficient maybe as well. So efficient in terms of if I was to swim for an hour, with very poor efficiency as a very bad swimmer versus an elite swimmer that would swim for an hour and not burn as much energy in terms of being much more efficient. So that can be a factor in terms of training age and experience and that side of things.
Okay, so just an idea of, so this is an example of sort of very basically for the different types of activities at low intensity or high intensity, how much kilojoules per kilo of body weight you're going to burn. So trying to make it simple, as a breakdown, you can see that running is almost 2 times as great as cycling. So if you're running for an hour versus cycling for an hour, you're going to burn almost twice as much energy. So that's just a breakdown for the different types of activity. And also that rowing is pretty close to running. Running probably being the main one just because it's supporting body weight. But rowing for an hour and running for an hour is going to burn pretty close to the same amount of energy. So this is, and we'll save the slides and stuff just so it's a nice way to just sort of give an idea of what you might be burning in a given session for a different type of activity. And just some really basic examples down the bottom there of an hour of light rowing for a 70 kilo female being 2,500 kilojoules or 500, 600 calories. And for a male running for about 45 minutes, it's almost 1,000 calories. So just some numbers to start thinking about. Okay, so the final one I've got here is how much, so what's the total cost to fuel the machine when we think about just the basic requirements to stay to be, and then adding on exercise on top of it. So again, for our groups of athletes here, I've just tried to break it down into a basic schematic of how much they might be training. And then we're talking about what's the total sort of intake we need to be having. So if you look here at heavyweight elite females and males, they're having almost double the energy requirements of the school level rowers. So that's something that as the athletes are transitioning through, that it's quite a steep learning curve to know that the training time is doubling, but they're also bigger, they're burning more energy. So the food intake habits need to significantly change, otherwise we get caught in that negative balance. And finally, just to sort of break it down into a week, so we were looking at just total day, but if we break down a week, different days are going to require different amounts of energy. So it's not as simple as just having a set amount each day. You balance your intake to support the type of activity you're doing. So especially for our elite guys, rather than getting stuck into a routine of eating the same thing every day, it very much has to be tailored to the type of day they're having. So this is a quick example of what an 85 kilo male or a 70 kilo female might be having around some key sessions. And some really interesting ones to note is on a Tuesday and Saturday, they're burning twice as much as they are on a rest day on Sunday. So your energy intake would want to reflect that.
But unfortunately, because of then that being more time poor with having 3 sessions over the day, it's very easy to fall into that trap of energy intake not reflecting that training load, and to be eating the least sometimes for athletes on the days they're doing the most because they're so busy, and then eating more than they necessarily need or on a rest day or on a Sunday, or and it can be a bit mismatched. And so it's trying to get that message of fueling for the work required to to best match their training and their intake.
How well can our bodies roll over a day? So say you obviously got a really big day and you haven't been time poor. Can you eat that night big from a big day you've just had, or even the next morning? Can you eat big there for recovery of the day before, or is it you've always got to eat before what you're going to expend?
I guess it's what's going to be practical. Certainly it's going to help to try and make up for that your lower intake during the day sort of as soon as possible, like that night and the next morning is going to help. And for some that might be more practical than trying to get it in more spread out over the day. I guess it depends on someone's appetite and how comfortable they are with big meals versus small meals and what's going to sit best for them. But it's better than kind of going, oh well, I stuffed it.
Yeah, okay.
What is the trade-off? So if you had a big Saturday, you didn't eat what you should. Does that mean that perhaps when you had a next big day on Monday, you didn't recover as well?
Quite possibly, yeah. If you're just not going to pull up as well as you as you might if you better optimise that recovery, nutrition and fueling, and and also in terms of immune function with big training sessions, there's that good 24 hours of suppressed immune function afterwards, just due to the nature of high intensity exercise. And if nutrition's then lacking at the same time, it just kind of puts you a bit more at risk in terms of illness and that side of things.
I think ultimately
Is there a point where the amount of food you eat no longer matters? Like if I had 2 bowls of dinner compared to 3 bowls of dinner, am I still going to, is there a point where your body just says, I can't extract anymore? Does it take time to extract?
there might be a saturation point if you're just trying to get in all your calories at the end of the day, probably. But again, it comes down to being planned, and I know it gets to that stage where the athlete wants how do I do it? But it ultimately comes down to being planned and knowing when you have your key sessions. And the other thing is interesting, if you do a high intensity session, it does suppress your appetite, so you don't feel like it. So in that situation, something like liquid forms of energy and stuff where that might help, because you don't feel like you're physically eating. But being planned for it's the key. I wouldn't say if you didn't eat all day, don't try and smash in 25,000 kilojoules at the end in a sitting. But yeah, it's better than nothing. Just try and catch up, but within reason, I guess is the immoral. Yeah. Okay, so now I've presented a lot of numbers. Emily's just going to try and break what those numbers look like. So what does a 25,000 kilojoule day look like? But I think she's going to quiz you first.
So I'd just like to do a bit of a knowledge assessment. And I find that with the food there can be a lot of confusion, a lot of different messages. There's so much out there, it's easy for people to just get a bit lost at times. And even with the macronutrients, so thinking of carbs, protein and fat. And if we just start with carbs and making sure we're all on the same page with where our carbs come from in terms of food. So carbohydrates play a really important role with fueling training sessions, with high intensity sessions, as well as longer duration, lower intensity. But certainly with rowing, it's a pretty carb demanding sport. So if everyone can stand up. Now with each picture I'm going to put on the screen, I want you to think about whether you think it's high, medium or low carbohydrate. So if you think it's low, put your hands on your hips, and to be technical, low being less than 5 grams of carbs in that amount of food. Medium, hands on your shoulders, 5 to 19, and 20 grams or more carbs in that amount of food being high. So we'll do a bit of a practice run, and then it's a knockout competition. A cup of high-low milk. Low, medium or high carbs. Medium, so you can stay standing. So the carbohydrates in milk is in the form of lactose, which is a type of sugar, and different types of sugars come under the carbohydrate umbrella. A cup of orange juice.
Is this knockout time?
Yes, now so if you get it wrong, you sit down. Hi. So you've all heard it takes a few oranges to make a glass of orange juice. So that's where it can be a bit sneaky, but that can actually be quite helpful at times for athletes as well when they have high carb needs. A medium-sized potato. Uh-oh.
Oh, showdown.
A decent-sized banana. Oh, wow, well done. Round of applause. Now you can just shout out what you reckon for the rest. Bottle of nutrient water. High, yep. Handful of almonds.
Low.
Always gets people. Low. They're higher in protein and fat and fibre, but pretty low in terms of carbohydrates. Killer python. High. Tin of tuna. Donuts. a low-fat strawberry squeeze from Boost Juice. Hi.
Sugar.
It is 600 ml, but yeah, they can be pretty sneaky. 2 eggs. No carbs in eggs. Got to have the toast to get the carbs. Low-fat vanilla yogurt. And this will naturally vary between brands, but sometimes, but not always, low-fat might mean higher, like added sugar, but not necessarily. But it's more the flavour, the vanilla that can be a bit of a hint. But you can always check the ingredients. Cup of white rice. It's getting easier now. Hi. Can of Coke. Hi. Cup of broccoli. Low. All right, so just to summarise, when I ask someone where they think carbohydrates are, it's pretty consistent that people, be confident with those 2 groups, and then after that it can get a bit confusing. So as you are hopefully more confident now, it's all of our fruit, our milk and yogurt that naturally contain lactose. If they're flavoured, they might be a bit higher. Our legumes, beans, lentils, chickpeas, etc. And then our sometimes type foods can often be high in carbs, but might not be the best everyday choices to meet our carb needs, but can still fit in. So, and just to finish off the carb story, any ideas with the fill in the blanks? So this is the carbohydrate umbrella. I think I just heard one of the starches and sugars in food, or our carbohydrates, essentially end up as glucose in our blood, which is stored as glycogen in our muscles and our liver. And that's what is a key energy source or fuel source for training sessions. So a bit of a just summary around some training nutrition before I kind of lead into those example days of varying energy intake. So pre-training in general, it helps to have a bit of fuel in the tank. A very kind of general guide is aiming for around 1 gram per kilo carbohydrate, so that takes into account varying needs in terms of body size, but certainly it's going to depend on the session. A lower intensity, less quality session, people can be fine fasted, or if it's an early morning and they struggle to get something in, then that's not necessarily going to be the end of the world. But if it's a decent session, or if you have 2 sessions over the day, or it's a big week, it's certainly optimal to try and be consistent with getting something in in a carbohydrate form. The timing can be tricky, so it might be optimal to aim for 1 to 2 hours between eating and training to allow time for that food to move out of our stomach, so it's not going to cause discomfort or want to come back up. But certainly with early morning sessions, that's a bit easier said than done. So again, if it's a small snack like a banana or a muesli bar or a slice of raisin toast, often people are okay with getting that in, on their way to training or in a shorter window. It's really individual. Otherwise, liquid options can be a bit easier to get some carbs in. That's not going to be as heavy or take as long to move through. It's probably more so with sports like running, where it's trickier to eat as close because your stomach's moving around. And rowing, can be very individual, I find, with how comfortable people are eating beforehand.
Can I just ask a quick question that if you do have an early morning training session, you don't feel like getting up at 3 a.m. to eat, how much influence does the meal the night before have?
Yeah, it definitely can play a role. So, if you know that it's going to be not so practical to eat enough before a decent training session in the morning, then being a bit more mindful of carbohydrate intake in the evening before, or having a supper snack before bed, is certainly going to help to just top up or optimise those glycogen stores for a morning session. So it's thinking of that as your pre-meal in a way. If the first thing at 5 o'clock in the morning is just not going to be so doable. And then during, which I'll go into a little bit more, it's, hydration is key, but certainly for long sessions, double sessions, carbohydrates can play an important role for fueling that session as well. And I'll go into some examples in a moment. So just in terms of other liquid options for pre-training, essentially they can either be milky based or sweet. So whether it's a smoothie, sausage and sport, up and go, or along the lines of a sports drink, potentially diluted sports drink. Coconut water is basically the same, very similar carb sugar content to sports drink. So, and I think a lot of people probably aren't aware of that or don't think of it the same way they might think of sports drink. So, yeah, that just makes it a potentially useful option as a fueling fluid. And then fruit juice is hypertonic, or sort of can be close to double the sugar concentration of sports drink and coconut water, and so that can actually make it less ideal to have before, because it's just not as effective in terms of that absorption. So diluting fruit juice, like having half water, half juice, can be an option. Does that make sense? And so back to the thinking around the duration. So for that, for sustained sessions, it can be like thinking of long rowing sessions, like thinking like a cyclist or a triathlete or a runner that fuels properly, which can be a bit hit and miss. But the guidelines around carbohydrate intake for sustained, reasonable intensity and beyond sessions is 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour. And while you don't necessarily have to get too technical, I think it's just good to have some awareness to consider to, again, fuel for that work required. The kind of upper limit, you max out at 90 grams of carbs per hour. And I don't know if I've come across a rower that's ever got that in during a session. It's more relevant for like an Ironman triathlon, where it's that really like 8-9 hours plus at a pretty reasonable intensity, where that can be useful. So what does 30 to 60 grams of carbs look like? So each of these provide around 30 grams of carbs, give or take. So it could be, one of these per hour as a rough guide. For lower fuel needs, a smaller person, or close to 2 of these per hour for higher requirements. So there's a combination of sweeter options, and you'll notice these are not quite on the everyday healthy snacks list, but that they kind of play a role in fueling during exercise, in that they're sort of quick to digest, practical, easy. You don't necessarily want to be eating baked beans or a grainy roll like during exercise, because it's about having low fibre kind of simple options. But whether that is fruit or a fruit puree option, they might not be the most economical version, but they can be quite convenient as a fueling option for during or between sessions where you just need something quick and easy. So one of these is, this particular flavour, the tropical snack, has around 28 grams of carbs, which is similar to a sports gel. I didn't manage to throw in the bag. And I would say much more palatable. I'm sure anyone's tried a gel, they're not always someone's cup of tea. You have to wash them down with a bit of water, and they can be a bit gross. They're sort of more really convenient for marathon runners and triathletes. But they are a bit smaller and not as bulky. Sports drink, around 500 ml sports drink gives 30 grams of carbs, and it's obviously then providing hydration and electrolytes as well. And then some savoury, saltier options if people aren't so keen on the sweet things. Again, some of these might be more relevant for those triathlon scenarios, but it's just thinking of those longer sessions and bigger days where these options can be practical for during or in between to be getting enough fuel in the tank. Any questions on that?
Yeah, so would you recommend to have the difference between a banana and having a Turkish delight? In the morning, why?
I just like to give options, but certainly a banana is going to be a more nutritious whole food option. Sometimes, to keep a variety or have options, a Turkish delight gives about 38 grams of carbs and can just be, something that's a bit different. And in terms of chocolate bars, that would be the pick as a fueling option because it's lower fat than the average, like say Mars bar. It's going to be a bit quicker to digest. Like it's mainly just that, Turkish jelly stuff. And so, I wouldn't say it's, to rely on that kind of thing every day, but to have it in the mix can keep things a bit more fun. I certainly know if I'm on a 3-hour bike ride, there's nothing more exciting than ripping over my shiny Turkish delight bar.
But the quality of carbohydrates is the same,
Well, to put it bluntly, I guess it's going to end up as glucose in the bloodstream wherever it's come from, but it's more, around what it's packaged with that makes a difference. Like certainly a banana's the ideal everyday option, and having a Turkish delight here and there is going to be okay. Yeah.
Will they process as quickly? Like, would the amount of glucose you get out of a Turkish delight into the bloodstream is really fast? Would the banana also enter in just as fast? Is it a bit more delayed? Like, would you make the whole hour with the Turkish? Is it just this massive rush of it? You could for 20 minutes and then.
I would say it's going to be a little bit slower than like a gel or jelly beans, which is a bit more pure sugar. Like the Turkish delight, the fact there is a little bit of fat there is going to slow it down a bit. So it's not, so I wouldn't say it's going to be like the real like sugar rush type scenario, but glucose response to foods can vary between individuals as well. So, and I guess also in the perception, like some people notice they're a bit more sensitive to changes in blood sugar levels than others. I'd say it's more a minority that really notice, like if they have something like a feeling, an obvious feeling, sort of afterwards. But certainly a real thing. So it's sort of, trying different things and feeling confident with what, works for you and sits well, and having some options up your sleeve. Anyone keen on the do-it-yourself mashed potato gel? So again, I've had Ironman like athletes that can't stand the sweet stuff that make mashed potato, put it in a little Ziploc bag, cut the corn off, and then tape it over so they can squeeze it out like a gel. Salty, savoury option. It's not too many people that get excited about that. Vegemite, my top 3 personal favourites are the fruit puree Vegemite sandwich and the Turkish delight. If I'm, wanting to feel happy on a 3+ hour bike ride. Okay, recovery nutrition. What are the 3 R's of recovery nutrition? Any guesses? Pardon? Replace. It makes sense, but it's not quite the R I'm after. But along those lines, it's a synonym, I'd say. There's lots of others. Pardon? Replenish, again, makes sense, but it's not the one I want.
Just gotta give us these ones.
You can do it. Rehydrate, bingo, that's one of them.
Think about the engine. What does the engine need?
Refuel, bingo. And the last one's always the slightly trickier one to guess. It's to do with...
If you do a gym session, what have you done to your muscles? So,
Yeah, easy. So refuel, which is where the carbohydrates come in around our glycogen stores, repairing the muscle damage where the protein, but certainly carbs, help out with that as well. And then rehydrating in terms of fluid and replacing fluid losses, plus a bit extra. So just some basic examples of options that can kind of tick those boxes. Certainly you'll hear about that optimal recovery window, and can be a topic of debate and different opinions. And I'd say it's certainly helpful to get something in sooner than later, but there's not necessarily need to panic about it either. Like if your next meal is within an hour or so after a training session, then that's quite possibly can tick the boxes in terms of recovery if there's protein and carbs and plenty of veggies. Whereas if you know you're not going to be having a meal for a little while, then having a recovery snack that's going to meet those needs is ideal. And yeah.
Sorry, if you're training at say 9 in the morning and then 3 at night, right? So there's a 6-hour window.
Yes.
And you do enough that you know you probably need 3 hours worth of recovery food time up before your next meal to get replenished. Does it matter if you eat at 9, 10, 11, 12, as long as you're getting enough before the next session?
Yeah, no.
Do you have to eat?
No, I think it can actually be sometimes more effective to sort of have smaller and spread it out a bit more than necessarily just trying to get the same amount in one go.
And do you need to? What I'm saying is, if you only need 3 hours worth of nutrition, can you go 3 hours after a session, or is that going to do a detrimental effect on your body?
Some of the processes are just more in terms of say glycogen refueling, are more primed or a bit more effective sooner after than waiting. So I'd say aiming for at least within 2 hours after would be a good goal.
If you could have been doing this time restricted eating.
Yes.
So you're only eating for 10 hours of the day.
Yeah.
And so the first meal's at 9, they finish session at 7. Not eating for that 2 hours, is there going to be any detrimental effects to that? Hard to say, definitely. I'd probably try and fit in that window where it's going to least affect training like recovery and fueling, but that might be easier said than done as well. Or whether it's just if it's been a really demanding session, or it's a big 2 sessions, to have a bit more flexibility, whereas on days where it's maybe not as as quality or as hard, that you can. If you do a big session, you need to refuel pretty quickly afterwards.
Yeah, well, at least within that 1 or 2 hours, I'd aim for. Particularly if you are backing up later that day. Whereas if you had the next 24 hours plus off, then it's not going to be the end of the world.
How long would it take you to refuel after a big session? It just depends on the amount of calories you eat after that session.
Well, it does, what you have for the 24 hours after does sort of have an effect, but having something in that immediate window, just, there's going to be a better efficiency in terms of glycogen refueling and muscle repair, and you're not going to be in that catabolic state as much. And so when you're trying to build strength and optimize muscle mass at the same time, then you're sort of taking the edge off that catabolic state that you're in after a training session.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Another question? Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
A typical, say, master row would get up at 5, be on water maybe by 4 to 6, and not even, since their last meal the next day. What sort of fuel would they have before? Because, you seem to be saying 1 or 2 hours.
Yeah. Well, that's where just having a banana, yeah.
Yeah, or a liquid, like a bit of juice or something to just line the stomach.
A hot Milo, a hot sustagen if it's a cold morning.
Yeah.
A slice of raisin toast or regular toast, even just something small, I think can be better than nothing. And part of it is the fueling, but it also can set up the rest of the day a bit better in terms of energy levels and appetite management, so that you don't end up starving. It will catch up with you later if you don't sort of start off the day well. So just from that side of it can be helpful as well. Just some visual examples of recovery meals. So, breakfast, lunch, dinner options can often work pretty well for recovery. Yeah, and there's not always that need to build in extra snacks. It really depends on the individual and their overall needs. So, back to thinking about those examples in terms of some bigger days and lighter days in the week. So if we think of, say, that Tuesday where it can be 17 to 21,000 kilojoules as the need to include that exertion from the 3 sessions, as well as energy needs just for living, what that could look like in food. So this is 21,000 kilojoules in total. And so our energy comes from carbs and protein and fat. So this is a higher carb day, but given it is 3 sessions in the day, so before that first session having a banana and some sausage and sport with some milk. During or between sessions, having a sports drink and a Turkish delight. Oh, and that I've added an extra 0. That's 1,500, not 15,000. Sorry. At the shed or like immediately straight after that, second session, having a Chobani yogurt and some almonds, and then getting home. And again, I know this is going to look different depending on if you've got a rush to work or uni, etc. Eggs and toast and some veggies, fruit, morning tea. My favourite lamb and quinoa salad, so some lamb, some quinoa or brown rice, salad and a glass of orange juice. Raisin toast and jam as that pre-training option. A muesli bar or a banana pancake, or I've just had that in my brain when I was writing this, for straight after the session. That's going to be a bit of travel time to get home to dinner. Having some salmon and rice and veg and a smoothie before bed just to top up, if there's a big session the next morning. So for some that can seem like a lot of food. For others, they could eat that with their eyes closed and still be hungry.
I think what's interesting there is it is like, to the normal person that looks like a lot of food, but that's 21,000. So the biggest energy requirements we have are close to 25 or 30 in some cases. But that accounts for, it was probably 14 hours in that training week, and it just highlights how much you need to fuel the body. And when you put it out like that, and I don't know if there was some stuff out when Michael Phelps used to train and the amount he used to eat in a day, and it just puts some perspective behind it. And I think that's probably some of the junior athletes coming in and transitioning, really when they train more, is going, you need to significantly adjust what your body needs to support the demands that we're placing on you through training. So it's a nice way to look at it, because it does look like a lot, but when you are training sometimes up to 3-4 hours a day, which is not unfamiliar to people in this room, is that it does require a lot.
Whereas a lower, to adjust this to kind of a day where there's 1 or 2 sessions, and it can be easy enough to take out the pre or recovery options and keep the meals sort of similar-ish, and you're going to adjust it as needed. That can often just be an easy way to think about it, is that you're just playing around with that pre and post session nutrition to really adjust depending on the day. Whereas that lower day example for the male at around 10,000 kilojoules on their Sunday, then there's less eating occasions, but still some similar options, slightly smaller portions at some meals. And so say if this is the Sunday, where the carbs are probably more towards the end of the day, knowing there's that starting the week on Monday morning. So it's certainly not about having a super low carb day. It's just around adjusting the fuel. So there's a bit of a higher percentage of energy coming from fat and a bit of a lower percentage of energy coming from carbs, and a similar sort of protein proportion, but still a nutrient rich quality diet sort of intake over the day. Does that make sense? So I guess it's been a topical, in the little nutrition world, I sometimes lose track of maybe what's so topical in the normal world. I get in my little bubble at times, but there's a lot of confusion around carbs in particular, and low carb, high fat, high carb, low fat. People feel like they have to be in one camp or the other, and I think a lot of people in the sports nutrition space are agreeing on this more periodized approach and having a more smart carb, and adjusting as needed, or looking at getting the bang for your buck where you need it, and maybe keeping it lower at other times of the day or other parts of the week where it's not as crucial. But again, it depends on individual goals, and sometimes that can help from a body composition aspect, but if someone's really on the gain train, then they don't necessarily need to be going low carb at any point. So, yeah, it comes back to that individual level. So just to touch on competition nutrition and just to talk through some of these questions or see what you think. So based on sort of what we've chatted about, what to eat the night before a regatta or a competition, what would you say, what comes to mind? Something pasta? Something that includes some kind of carbohydrates? Yep.
Is there any consistency they need to give to that sort of low GI, high GI? Or is that a bit of a...
Good question. So the glycemic index, or the GI, is around that glucose response to carbohydrate foods. And I guess I tend to kind of consider it secondary to other aspects, or certainly secondary to amounts, because at the end of the day, when foods are tested for their GI, they're tested in isolation. So you're eating like just a potato or just rice or just fruit. And for a lot of foods, it's not often you necessarily eat that in isolation. So say, white potatoes, for example, or even white rice often gets this kind of bad, like a negative association because it's high GI. But I don't know how many people eat a potato on their own unless they're doing their mashed potato gel. But in terms of often a potato is in a meal, in a curry with, steak and veg, like those other things within the meal affect the GI of the whole meal. So protein and fibre and fat all lower the GI. So I don't, white potato, sweet potato, they're both great. Like enjoy both of them, or mix it up. And even rice, certainly going for, brown rice where it's got a bit more fibre, a bit more nutrient rich, that's great. But having white rice isn't the end of the world, in the mix either. Like I don't tend to stress as much about the GI particularly when it's in a combined meal, that's going to get thrown out or if anything lowered anyway. Does that make sense? Certainly, yeah, focusing on hydration before the day, evening before competition is important as well. How soon before racing do I eat? Ideas? Yep, so it's knowing what's comfortable for you. So for some people it could be, half an hour, for others it could be 2 hours. It's really kind of can vary a bit with appetite and nerves and that kind of thing. But certainly if nerves are playing a role, if anything, allow a bit more time than less, because that anxiety can slow that stomach emptying rate. So yeah, that's one thing to keep in mind. And again, liquid options can be handy in those situations as well. Eat or drink after racing, it's really the same as that recovery nutrition for training that we spoke about. And short gap between races. What are your thoughts? Pardon? Yep, jelly beans. So some people might find they just want to drink water or like not necessarily need to eat, but certainly sometimes some simple sugar, jelly beans, some fruit, some sports drink can even just have from a sort of mental aspect a benefit. Like there's even been studies where doing carbohydrate mouth rinses, so just swishing it around and spitting out again, has a potential benefit, because it's just like that brain's got that frontal lobe activation, as they call it, like that kind of thought that there's some sugar in there and it can make you feel better. So, I mean, how often people, well, yeah, again, depends. I'd say if you're not on a crazy energy budget, you don't need to spit it out, you can just swallow it. But I guess it's more if it's going to cause any gut upset, that sometimes people, don't want to always drink it all. So, I'll let Binnie speak again in a moment, but almost there. Just wanted to touch on this scenario that can happen with big training loads, where the fuel isn't matching the work required, and we can run on empty. So just a little quick history lesson. Out of interest, put your hand up if you've actually heard of the female athlete triad. So this was first described like 20, 25 or more years ago as this, scenario that often happened with female athletes, where there were these sort of three things interlinked. So disordered eating, osteoporosis, and amenorrhea, or absence of menstrual function. And it's evolved since then to sort of take into account that the eating disorder, that bit's probably been renamed the most in terms of low energy availability with or without an eating disorder. So that can be the result of an eating disorder, but not necessarily. And that flows into this menstrual function and bone health aspect, but it's seen as more of a continuum of severity. So, at the ideal end, optimal energy availability, optimal bone health, and eumenorrhea or normal menstrual function. So the low energy or the energy availability is really the driver of the other aspects. And what does this energy availability term mean? So it's essentially what's left when you take the exercise energy output from the energy intake. And it's expressed as, per kilo of fat-free mass or lean mass, so it's sort of relative to that aspect of an individual size. So our body needs energy to, do other things, as we've mentioned, and to stay healthy and in a more optimal state. And if there becomes too big a mismatch, like a really significant mismatch consistently over time, so the energy intake's too little and that for the output, then we end up in this low energy availability state. And this then means that the body doesn't have enough energy left to support its other, body systems. So the classic example is when, for a female, when their period becomes irregular or stops altogether because the body's just going, well, I've only got so much energy, what can I live without but still stay alive? And reproductive function's one of them. So that gets put on hold or sacrificed because of this low energy availability. And so it can be a red flag, so to speak, for this scenario. But that then means that there's a change or disruption to normal hormonal cycles. Less estrogen means a negative impact on bone health. There's, in terms of just the low energy availability, there's then impaired immune function, and things aren't in an optimal state. And it's now recognised this isn't just a female problem. This happens to males as well. So the current kind of model is red S, or relative energy deficiency in sport, and the female athlete triad is kind of just embedded within that. So it's acknowledging that it's a male and female athlete issue, and that there's a whole range of functions that are affected. It's beyond just bone health and menstrual function. So this is a whole nother topic, but I just wanted to touch on it to sort of look at what can happen when there is too big a mismatch between intake and output. And rowing is because of the demands, it's one of the craziest sports in terms of hours of training a week. It's I guess can be a high risk sport for this happening, particularly with lightweight rowers, where they're doing these huge hours of training and then trying to restrict their intake at the same time. So want to sort of raise awareness around it. So now I'll hand over to Binnie.
Just touching on what you were saying, I think it's more the awareness of it. I think it is quite common in our athletic population, and probably things that would present as fatigue or illness stem from the idea that it is just the lack of energy availability and the body is responding in certain ways. So I just wanted to touch on sort of how we've been using it in practice and how we're measuring it, because we've got probably the last 10 years or so more strategies to monitor and diagnose this, and it's done by doing metabolic rate testing. So what I touched on before, so we the athlete's favourite test, they come in, we put them on the same machine, we do all their VO2 testing, and we just measure how much energy they're burning at rest. and we make that, as Emily said, relative to the amount of lean tissue they have in their body, and we go, well, we know that for every kilo of muscle they should have this much energy, and if the body's suppressed, then that tells us that the body's not functioning optimally. And that happens when there's a big mismatch, as Emily said.
And an
so
athlete doesn't have to be super lean for this to happen.
No.
That's what can be, where it can go unnoticed, I think,
Yeah.
particularly.
Or misdiagnosed.
Yeah.
And I think that responds in a number of different ways, from basic metabolic functions, hormone production, etc. But from a sport perspective, your recovery between training sessions is impaired, your ability to adapt is impaired, your propensity for sickness is impaired, and one of the biggest ones is you can't lose body weight, especially body fat. So you're training 20 hours a week, you're restricting, and you're not moving. So that's probably one of the biggest things is we have athletes who think they're doing the right thing by saying, okay, well, I'm overweight, I need to restrict and exercise more. And it's too big of a gap, and we see it a lot, especially with some of our lightweights who come back and try and restrict too quickly. They fall into this state, and they're in this balance where they can't move. So while we have obviously access to these things, I think it's more probably the awareness of it and just an understanding of how much you might need. So an exercise diary, so what I was speaking about before, how much you might burn for different sessions, high intensity, low intensity, and then a basic understanding of what is in different foods. So you know when you do a big day, you're getting around the amount. So it's just awareness. But in general, it's very individual. So concern around this and thinking it might be an issue or wanting some more information around it is definitely going to see sports dietitian like Emily to try and sort you out with one of those two things. For those more interested, the guys at UWA do run both the body scan and the metabolic rate testing for this type of stuff, and can get an idea of how is my metabolism sitting for some of the more elite athletes. So I just wanted to briefly touch on one of the athletes that we did a bit of work with and saw a response, and it's quite an interesting one. That she came in here so this is body weight on the right hand side, so heavier than she wanted to be. She was fatigued, training a lot, restricting, and what we did was we got her in and measured her metabolic rate was, so down there, about 6,000 kilojoules, which is relative to her lean mass below that cutoff that we want to see. So weight was high, but her metabolism was low. So while she was training lots and not eating very much, she wasn't getting much bang for her buck in the 99% of the time that she was spending. So,
and really grumpy.
So we needed to establish, okay, well, is there a mismatch? How big is it? What are your training demands? What are your current intake? And sure enough, there was a massive gap between them. So working between Emily and I to go, okay, well, how do we do this? And I guess there's different strategies around it, and it's very individual to situations. But as an example, sort of 200 calories or sort of 1,000 kilojoules a day or something for every week. So you might have an extra muesli bar or sustagen or an extra thing a day just to start bridging that gap. And it can take some time, and there's some, depending on the scenario, I think for lightweights who get stuck in a situation where they need to drop and they can't afford to increase weight, you have to be considerate of the time you might try and reset that, because you might have an initial increase in weight before the body gets happy and then resets. But for this particular athlete, this is a few months later, her body weight's dropped almost 4 kilos and her metabolism shot up, and that was from eating more and training the same. So the opposite of what you'd think. So I'm overweight, I want to lose weight, let's feed you more, and then you go down. So that it's just that idea that there are some people, and I know there's lots of athletes we work with now who get frustrated and say, well, I'm doing everything right, I'm exercising lots and eating and restricting, but my weight won't move. It's just
body kind of saying, F you, I'm going to.
Yeah, well, it just takes away the energy, and I think if you flick back, there's very much psychological, metabolic, everything is affected because your body doesn't have enough energy to do what it normally would do. So it's just awareness around that they're in certain situations, that's what could be causing it, just that imbalance. Okay, so just to briefly touch on another topic of so weight gain. So when we're talking about weight gain, why might we want to do it? So we've got juniors going to seniors, we want more size and strength, which drives power, but we know that especially under high training loads, heavier athletes who sit a little bit heavier are probably going to be more robust and more resilient to the load we put them under. So if we did want to get someone gaining weight, the general recommendations are, well, we want to be in a positive energy balance. So if you're having a 20,000 kilojoule day and you want to gain weight, well, you need to have anywhere from probably more to that end of the spectrum, because it's relative. So people who are a bit smaller might be falling more towards a 2,000, but that's the sort of surplus you need to be in to try and get your body to gain weight, okay? Protein's obviously a very important one for muscle growth, which Emily spoke about before. And timing, which we said before, is if you're trying to gain weight, or Emily said gain train, is you need to make sure you're giving the body fuel when it's in its most vulnerable and broken down. And I just wanted to touch on briefly, it obviously coincides with the type of training, because if you just eat and you don't train, you're going to put on the wrong type of weight. So in terms of the gym stuff, if you're wanting to gain weight, we're looking at higher number of reps, lower number of bit less rest, because we're wanting to force that metabolic stress on the body. So it should be hard, we should be really fatigued. If you're an athlete, like a lightweight who wants strength but doesn't want to put on muscle, then we might shift our gym training to less reps but a heavier weight, so we're forcing more of a neural type of strength adaptation. So that's something that we get a bit of question from before. So if you're trying to gain weight, the type of gym training you might need to do to support muscle is more around that high rep, lower rest stuff, as opposed to the heavier stuff. Very individual, but be patient with it. Might take a little bit of time, but something in the realm of 1 to 2 kilos, or depending on how big you are, where you're starting from, is not unreasonable for a month. That's a very dramatic slide transition.
This was just a little reminder of, I won't do the protein quiz for time, but summary of our key high protein food sources. So obviously a lot of animal protein features, but plant protein is important and effective as well. So our beans and legumes and nuts and seeds, grains, all could provide protein as well. And the reason quinoa features is it's just higher protein for the same amount of, say, rice or pasta, for example. Yep.
Protein supplements useful, or can we get what we need out of eating normal food?
Good question, and I think it'll get answered or incorporated in the next few slides. So just park it for a moment. They can be convenient, but may or may not always be essential. So just a bit of a summary around protein requirements for athletes generally. You can see, it's not huge spectrum in terms of the numbers. Generally, somewhere between 1 and 2 grams per kilo of body weight per day is a good guide. And when we're in that muscle gain aspect, it's at that higher end, and it's then also from that point is considered around total energy needs, and it's certainly not unusual for it to be higher than that, just in terms of reaching that sort of energy surplus that's necessary. So for that person aiming for 20,000 kilojoules a day, they're going to be having likely over 2 or 3 grams per kilo of protein, and that's not necessarily a problem. In terms of what the average Australian adult eats, is somewhere between 1 to 1.5 grams per kilo per day. The average female athlete between 1 to 2.8, average male athlete 1.5 to 4 grams per kilo. So protein always gets a lot of positive messages, so it can be not unusual for people to really just overdo their protein intake. But when someone is on that muscle gain focus, it is important, but it's more important that to sort of spread it out over the day than just purely focus on that total, or and it's best to avoid just getting it all in 1 or 2 hits, but really aim for 6 hits of protein over the day. What does it look like in food? So if we just think of a bit of a spectrum of 60 grams of protein for lower needs to that higher end of 160 grams of protein or more, and what that could look like. So for an omnivorous diet, you can see just from forage, eggs and some chicken or meat or fish that you're already getting 75 grams of protein, and to get to that 160 grams of protein is fairly doable, because that would also incorporate high energy needs as well, through wholesome food options. The SMP, any guesses what that stands for?
Some other kind of potato.
The very well marketed skim milk powder can be a cost-effective protein powder to fortify a smoothie or drink as an alternative to a more expensive but well marketed protein powder. And for a vegetarian intake, still quite doable as well. So a few more options to get to that 75 grams of protein, and then again a few more options again to get to closer to 160 grams of protein, with a plant-based protein powder in there just as an easy little boost as well. And really, well, on a side note, a vegan option really only cuts out the eggs and yogurt from that. So yeah, I think there can sometimes be, a lot of misunderstanding that you have to have animal foods to get protein, but it can be doable through a lot of high protein plant options. So any questions? So yeah, in terms of protein powder, it is a convenient option that for getting something in soon afterwards, or if appetite is low, or if someone has really high needs, it can help to throw it in, but I wouldn't say essential just to meet fairly normal or even higher protein requirements.
Is there any negative effect to having too much protein?
Well, a common misconception is that if you have more protein than you need, you just pee it out, and I think that stems from the fact that you excrete the nitrogen component of the protein in your iron, but essentially protein provides energy, so it will either be used for energy or stored as fat, so it can be easy to overdo total needs with like a protein powder. So that's one aspect. Cost would be another negative aspect. And if there's some existing kidney health issues, then I'd probably be a bit more mindful of not going too crazy on the protein powder as well. But it's considered for otherwise healthy people. That's not going to cause a kidney problem as such. I guess it just can be easy to overdo, but depends on needs. And the other risk would be in terms of contamination of banned substances. So that's just a risk with supplements in general, and protein powders come within that. So in terms of looking at the source of the product, so aiming ideally for a batch tested product that has third-party auditing and can be considered a lower risk option.
But there's no zero risk.
Pardon?
There's no zero risk.
There's never a zero risk, but does that make sense?
Yeah. Cool. So just to touch briefly on the other end of the spectrum is, you can keep it. Weight loss. So why would we want to lose weight? Good question. Well, we might band it under the term power to weight improvement, which is definitely the case for elite athletes, but we definitely have a lot of elite athletes come back over off season who we might call it power to weight, but we just want them to drop weight that they put on.
From a performance aspect.
And then you've got weight restrictions as well, people who need to make weight. So again, so we're talking about a planned energy deficit and what's safe, reasonable. Well, firstly, you need to know what you're currently required to know what a deficit is. So don't just go, I'm just going to eat less than I'm currently eating, because you might already be on the verge of being too low. So make it relative to you, but something around the same of the surplus in down, and making it relative. So obviously a lighter person's not aiming for 4,000 kilojoules, they're aiming more for the 2,000. And as we talked about before, so too much of a drop can drop your metabolism by up to 30%, and then you're just on a downhill train and you can't drop weight. So it actually, you end up going, if you go too far, you have a negative impact. And we certainly see that a lot with some of our lightweights who we need to manage them better when they come back at 80 kilos and say, okay, this is how we're stepping down, we're taking our time. And importantly, if you are going to restrict, you must keep your carbohydrates around your training and recovery. Don't sacrifice that, sacrifice it somewhere else. If you're in the position where you can add extra activity, some long, slow stuff, even just walking, cycling is going to be the best bang for your buck for trying to drop weight. So that light activity rather than intensity, especially if you're restricting. And something around the realm of 0.5 kilo a week or 1 to 4 kilos a month is not an unreasonable thing if you're planning ahead, saying, okay, I'm at 80, I need to be at 70. How long do I need? Which is not an unfamiliar scenario. To talk about just briefly in terms of lightweights of acute strategies. So if I'm 2 weeks out and I need to drop, so you want to be around 5% of your target weight. You don't want to be rolling in 2 weeks out at 76. It's not very helpful. And some of the strategies you can use that Emily could maybe chime in to as well, with just hydration, maybe accounting for about 2 to 3%.
Or dehydration.
Dehydration.
A safe level of dehydration.
Correct.
Not
So restricting energy, water content of food is going to do one, and a mild restriction of fluid, and especially sodium-containing fluids. Low residue being the fibre, so having lower fibre options can result in an acute loss of about half a kilo to 1 kilo. So that's multi-grain to white bread, high fibre cereal to low fibre cereal like rice bubbles, which are nice, and reducing your fruit and veg.
This is just for a very, this is acute stuff for 2 days. We're not. This
Not as
obviously it's
overall,
opposite to everyday healthy eating.
And finally, to talk about supplements, we've spoken about this before, but very much so, we adopt a food first approach. If we think you can get it from food, then there's no point in supplementing. To touch briefly on some of the more common ones that are talked about, your caffeine and your bicarb, and the gains you get from these things are so marginal that that you're talking about the very elite athletes only, Pete. So, but most of your training benefits are going to come from your consistency and quality of training. Those extra things are fantastic, but there's very rarely do you get someone who's so at their high level that is going to be the difference between them going slightly faster. There's so many other things.
There's too many offsides to bicarb. You get it wrong.
Oh yeah.
You bonk, or you vomit, or you shit.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So there's lots of stuff. And the one thing I did want to spruik, and mainly because it's a natural food source one, is dietary nitrate. There's been lots of research around what it can do for your oxygen economy and maximal aerobic performance, just because it helps you get blood around and oxygen around faster, and you can do it with your diet. So leafy, green and root vegetables, so beetroot, spinach, celery, having a little bit more of that 3 to 5 days out from a big competition is something you could easily do by just adding about 200 grams of some of those foods into your diet, which is a nice little one to look at.
Or if you generally just eat your half a plate of veggies, then that'll be helpful as well.
In elite athletes, is there a place for multivitamin, supplement things?
I think only, you comment on this, but only if there's a deficiency somewhere. So Emily would do a comprehensive food diary and say, okay, there's these things missing, and if you can plug the gaps with things, and you don't need a surplus of multivitamins. But
sometimes people do it as a bit of a safety net, have a multivitamin, but it can be a sort of psychological benefit as well. But something I wouldn't say is essential for athletes. Like often some people might argue, they're putting more stress on their body, therefore there's greater need for certain vitamin minerals, but often their energy intake's high enough to then account for a higher intake of vitamins and minerals if they're having a good quality diet, ideally. So for athletes that might be particularly fussy or limited for certain food groups for different reasons, then it can be more of a place to have a multivitamin or a certain vitamin or mineral supplement if there's if they've got a low iron issue and that side of things. But in general, not like a blanket benefit.
Just with low iron levels, and that's a pretty common problem with women. Now I understand that a lot of the problem comes from their ability to absorb the iron or take iron on. Is there anything that can be done to help that?
Well, in terms of from looking at a food aspect, vitamin C rich foods help with the absorption of iron, and whereas calcium rich foods can inhibit iron absorption, like they're two sort of nutrients that can play a particular role. If someone has a low iron history and has a reasonable dietary iron intake, I'm not sure on the prevalence, but it can be caused by an undiagnosed issue like celiac disease, for example. And I've seen athletes, celiac disease can be asymptomatic, so you don't necessarily have to be having gut distress and IBS-like symptoms. It can be kind of a silent condition, and a history of low iron can be a indicator for that. So there's blood tests that can be done to sort of screen or give an indication that show up certain antibodies that exist with celiac disease. The only catch is you have to be having gluten-containing foods in the diet in order for that blood test to be helpful. But otherwise, there's a gene test that doesn't matter about what you're doing with your diet that can exclude celiac disease. So there can be some things to look into if there's this kind of history that seems a bit unexplainable. Like certainly, females are at higher risk because of menstruation losses, but athletes in general are at higher risk of low iron because of some degree of gastrointestinal bleeding that occurs with high intensity exercise, with the foot strike hemolysis, like red blood cell breakdown through running, and there's some iron loss in sweat, but I wouldn't say it's as significant. But they're some of the reasons why athletes in general are at high risk of low iron stores. So it's always worth sort of.
The other brief one on that is that there is some more stuff coming out now about the timing of when you might have your iron, and immediately post-exercise your ability to absorb it's not as good. So potentially for those ones that might be at higher risk is just when do you have it? When are you trying to have your iron intake?
Which is why on that Sunday example, I actually purposely put steak as the dinner meal because it was on a rest day and wasn't going to be after a big training session. So the iron absorption was going to be more optimal. So I was actually thinking about that at the time and forgot to, on the 10,000 kilojoule. Yeah.
Boom.
But then and the veggies included some vitamin C rich veggies like capsicum and stuff.
Yeah.
So that's a really good point. There's some current research happening at the moment around the effect of exercise on iron absorption. So that's part of it.
Yeah. Cool. I think that's all from us. Any other questions?
I just have one more.
Yeah.
In regard to people trying to lose weight, is the timing of when you're eating, is that more significant? So for example, is eating a lot before going to bed bad?
So I would say depends, but
should you try and focus more of your eating pre-exercise?
I would certainly look at the time of most of your exercise in the day and try and sandwich more of energy intake closer to that. If you it's not gonna, doesn't mean you only eat before and after exercise, but certainly the intake might be higher in the morning if morning training is happening. If it's an afternoon evening session, then it's not going to be a problem if intake's higher in the second half of the day. So there can be benefit to trying to match that a bit more closely. I think the priority would still be looking at total intake over the day, but certainly that timing being secondary to that. And it's a classic dieting kind of rule to be like, don't eat after 6 or 8 or whatever time, and I wouldn't, subscribe to those kind of messages because I think it really does depend on the individual. And if they've got a late session and they're not getting home till 8 or 9, then I'd still want someone to have something to eat or have that recovery then, and it's going to help with feeling better the next day and appetite management and that side of things. I think often a helpful thing to consider can be hungry eating versus non-hungry eating, and there's that in itself could, for some people, can play a role in terms of influences on their total intake and having awareness around that and avoiding getting into those over-hungry states where it's easy for things to get out of control. And that comes back to that planning and thinking of food as fuel and not trying to end up in too much of a deprived or restricted state.
Any other questions for Martyn or Emily? No, we'll start my question out.
Great.
I just want to say thank you to you guys. That was
Good.
really good. Emily, you obviously have a Turkish delight addiction, but
The funny thing is, I actually
Popped
don't
up a few
really like
times.
them outside of, like, I can take them or leave them, like, normally, so that's why it's kind of good, because I can have a stash of them and they're not going to even interest me unless someone bites.